What do you play with your left hand when you're playing solo jazz piano, especially bebop? That's the big question. Hey, I'm Ron Drotos from keyboardimprov.com, and thanks for being here for our journey through the Real Book 145. This is an extension of the teaching I do at keyboardimprov.com, and we're going through the Real Book. One tune a week. I usually release these on Fridays. Whatever happens, bebop, swing, modern, Ornette Coleman, avant-garde, whatever it is, we just take it in order. And I'm doing this to challenge myself over 8 years, 400 tunes, roughly 50 weeks in a year. And I hope it inspires you to do something similar, or just to get to know some of these tunes, get to know the history of your favorite tune or how it relates to a larger picture than we sometimes get. So, speaking of larger pictures, something wonderful happened right at the beginnings of the bebop period, a little earlier than that. This is the late 30s, early 40s. Bass players freed themselves up from just playing the roots and fifths or even just the basic chord tones, and they started playing walking bass lines. So, great thing for bass players and for jazz in general. But what did it do for pianists? Well, the early jazz pianists like Jelly Roll Morton and Fats Waller and all those people, they would play stride, imitation of a big marching band, or Jelly Roll Morton with trombone lines. Fats Waller with like thumb lines. Different pianistic techniques. A lot of them came from classical music, the early jazz pianists, many of them highly classically trained. A fun story I like is that when Hardin Armstrong, who became Louis Armstrong's wife, and his pianist in his band, and did some of the arrangements of those early tunes, and he sort of, in a way, made him a star, or just dressed him up properly to be ready for stardom, and encouraged him to have ambitions like that. When she was a teenager, she was in this music store hanging out around where she lived in New Orleans, and the famous Jelly Roll Morton came in, and the owner of the store wanted to feature this young woman who could really play great piano, and he said, Lil, why don't you play something for Mr. Morton? She didn't play jazz, she played Rachmaninoff. I love that story because it doesn't mean jazz is totally derivative from classical, but it means that those techniques really informed the early jazz. And indeed, in the early days, you weren't considered a pianist unless you, quote, had a left hand, meaning had a really good left hand. The right hand wasn't even as important as the left hand. You had to have a left hand. When Art Tatum wanted to challenge Bud Powell, younger Bud Powell, to a piano contest, he said, anything you play with your right hand, I'll play with my left. And the contest never came to be, but the challenge was issued. I know that from stories and hearsay. I caught some of the pianists who were at the tail end of the beboppers. I studied with Billy Taylor in the 80s. And he was actually right before, he developed his style as a teenager right before bebop. And he remembers this transition where he was playing down here, and the bass player, I remember exactly the conversation. He said, Ron, I was playing, and this bass player said, hey man, get your left hand out of there. That's for me, And so Billy's like, well, what do I do? Okay, I guess I'll play up here. And he and the other early beboppers, and even Duke Ellington, developed what we now know as rootless voicings. That was from 1940, Duke Ellington, Cottontail. It's way before Bill Evans and John Mahegan's book about rootless voicings. So anyway, this stuff had historical precedence. But what happened was, because beboppers were playing so much in this register, just these chords, it sounded great. But on the other hand, as pianists like Herbie Hancock and Keith Jarrett have been talking about in recent decades, pianists in general in jazz sort of lost the two-handed concept, the fullness of the piano. And both Herbie and Keith have spoken about, when they got into their 60s and 70s, they wanted to reclaim their left hand, free up their left hand to play sort of equally with the right. And you can hear that, particularly in a lot of their solo playing for the last couple decades. So what do you do on Half Nelson? Well, yes, you can play rootless voicings, you can play shell voicings, but you could also do things just maybe with the chord roots. And that's what Billy Taylor would do so well. He would do things like, let's say, of play counterpoint, everything he knew how to do. Again, he had studied classical too. You don't need to do that, but a lot of it comes from that. You could play just clusters, G, A, B. You know, I love doing stuff like that. Very impressionist. You could do modal. Play counterpoint. Or like that was in unison, but upside down. Sort of like Bach, the inversion, or something similar. Or improvising counterpoint. Go to town. You can even play stride. It's a great thing in one of the biographies of Thelonious Monk. It talks about Billy Taylor because they became friends as teenagers or in their early 20s. And they used to go to all-night diners and talk about things. And Billy said, you know, what if we played stride in the left hand and bebop in the right, sort of like I just did. And you hear Monk do that, and Billy Taylor. They both went in that direction at times. So as pianists, historically, jazz pianists, we've come out of the tunnel where we're just playing these things with our left hand. We can still do that, but it's not the only thing we need to do or we can do. So I'm going to start with some of those clusters and just sort of see where it takes me. So I hope this encourages you to not only learn this tune if you haven't played it yet, or if you do know it, explore some of those different techniques. You can do some of them in a group, like the counterpoint, the clusters. Some of them work better solo piano, like these things down here. You're not necessarily going to do that when there's a bass player, unless you worked it out with them in advance and it worked. But explore all these different pianistic techniques. We've come out of that tunnel where it was just sort of the same thing on every tune, and really we have 88 keys at our disposal. Let's use them, like Keith Jarrett, Herbie Hancock, and those early jazz pianists that did so well. Thanks for being here. If you're looking for step-by-step instruction with your playing, check me out at keyboardimprov.com. Help you either through one-on-one Skype lessons, or you can take my video course. Hundreds of videos and step-by-step for you there. And I give personal feedback. Even if you take the course, you can send me an audio video, or I have quick little check-ins on Skype each week just to say hi and see how you're doing, maybe give you a little tip and assignment if you want, practice, something to practice. Good luck with your playing, and next week, let's see, we're going to, another great tune, Have You Met Miss Jones, which was an inspiration for John Coltrane's Giant Steps. See you then.